Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of A Foggy Day on Olympus. And this is the second episode in our series on fundamentalism. Those of you with long memories stretching all the way back to, 2 or 3 weeks ago, will remember that we just did a series on the difficulties that the Roman Catholic Church had with coming to grips with modernity. And the series on fundamentalism is a kind of parallel in respect of evangelicalism.
Right. So this is our second episode in this series on fundamentalism, which I believe this is your title, No Kin to a Monkey.
Yes, it was the kind of thing that was shouted by opponents of evolution. I'm no kin to a monkey.
Right. So we're looking at the Scopes trial of 1925. And just to remind our poor viewers, last time you rather ferociously defined fundamentalism as referring exclusively to a certain kind of evangelical Christianity. And so it's a kind that is culturally and ethically rigid and insists on literalist interpretation of scripture, regardless of whether that is appropriate or how earlier Christians read particular passages.
Yep, that's basically it. I think I made the point that the word is far too freely used as a sort of boo word for anything that the person speaking doesn't like. And that just helps misunderstanding. And we're here about clarity. So, yeah, the definition you just mentioned, that had included literalist readings of early Genesis with the beginnings of the fundamentalist movement in the early 1910s. But that particular emphasis was to become almost central to the whole movement, to become its defining distinctive. And that really gets going with this extremely famous or notorious, according to how you look at it, trial in Dayton, Tennessee in 1925, which was in its way epoch making.
Right. So that's what this new episode is all about. And
Right.
we're going to really see the drama and the action going on here.
Yes. And we'll start off by looking at the various protagonists. So let's begin with this man, John Washington Butler. And he was a Tennessee legislator, and he was head of the World Christian Fundamentals Association, which was a non-denominational group founded in 1919, so just 6 years before the trial, by Baptist evangelist William Bell Riley.
Now, William Bell Riley is someone we're going to look at more next week.
Yeah, we are, definitely. So Butler sponsored an act in the Tennessee legislature passed on March 21st, 1925, making it illegal to teach evolution in public schools. So this is the rationale he gives for what is called, after him, the Butler Act. In the first place, he says, the Bible is the foundation upon which our American government is built.
One still hears this claim from certain types of people.
Yeah, one does, from, let us call them latter-day fundamentalists and other figures on the religious right.
Right, but it's funny because most of the founding fathers were deists, not Christians.
Yeah, literally, well, only one that I can actually remember off the top of my head, but there might have been maybe one other, were evangelical Christians for sure. And yeah, as you say, most of them were deists of one kind or variety of another. Of course, John Adams famously said that our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate to the government of any other. An analysis which I strongly suspect is true, actually. But Adams was not himself an Orthodox Christian.
Okay, so why could people like Butler tell themselves this then?
Well, there are two reasons. Firstly, you could argue that the Constitution was built on a biblical worldview. Now, even this is at least debatable at two different levels, but we're not going to go there now.
Well, one of those levels is going to include Anabaptist points about what is biblical, isn't it?
Yes, and moving swiftly on, Secondly, evangelicals had held an informal cultural dominance for 2 or 3 generations, such that it became easy to identify biblicism with Americanism.
Okay, well, can we get on a bit now?
Yeah, let's move swiftly on here. So Butler says the evolutionist who denies the biblical story of creation, as well as other biblical accounts, cannot be a Christian. It goes hand in hand with modernism, makes Jesus Christ a fakir, like an Oriental holy man, which in that racist age was taken to be denigrating in itself, right? Robs the Christian of his hope and undermines the foundation of our government. I mean, never mind that B.B. Warfield, who was himself one of the early fundamentalist leaders, accepted evolution. But anyway, the movement is drifting strongly to the anti side. Okay, well, complication. Tennessee public schools required the use of the textbook Hunter's Civic Biology, which had been published in 1914, so in print for 11 years, which included a chapter on evolution. So, if that's the required textbook and the new law requires them not to teach evolution, they're essentially required to break the law.
Yeah, so Tennessee law was self-contradictory, and you really
Right.
couldn't avoid breaking it one way or the other.
No, you couldn't. Not in this new situation. The American Civil Liberties Union, which had been founded in 1920, which then, as now, is strongly secularist, was looking for a test case if they could find a Tennessee teacher who was willing to act as a defendant. Right. So someone who is willing to be prosecuted, so that this thing could go to law and tested. And some businessmen in Dayton, Tennessee, approached John Scopes. Now, he was initially reluctant. He was only a young man. He was only 24, darn it. But he eventually agreed to be the subject of such a case. Now, before we dive into that, let's just take a look here at this textbook, Civic Biology by George William Hunter. Now, as well as containing a chapter teaching evolution, this textbook supported eugenics and racial segregation. So, on eugenics, here's a quotation: "If such people were lower animals, we would probably kill them off to prevent them from spreading. Humanity will not allow this, but we do have the remedy of separating the sexes in asylums or other places, and in various ways preventing intermarriage and the possibilities of perpetuating such a low and degenerate race. Remedies of this sort have been tried successfully in Europe and are now meeting with success in this country."
And I love this part where they appeal to humanity not allowing this, as if they're actually having some sort of moral ground to stand on for the rest of us.
Well, yes, the whole darn thing is way murkier than anybody on any side now wants to face up to. And of course, we being who we are, that's exactly what we're highlighting here, right? This whole thing is a darn mess. Concerning race, the book says there exist upon the earth 5 races. Okay. The highest type of all, and I'm sure you'll be astonished to hear this, the Caucasians, represented by the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America.
Of course.
Of course. So the humanist lot are definitely in the racist camp here. Well, okay, what about the trial then? Nicknamed the Scopes Monkey Trial. The defendant is this young man, John T. Scopes, a biology teacher in a public school. For the prosecution was Sue Hicks, a local businessman and friend of Scopes, but he's prosecuting him. And his main interest was really in publicity for the town, and boy, did it succeed at that. Dayton, Tennessee became the center of the universe while this trial was going on.
So this really is a boy named Sue.
Yeah, it really is a boy named Sue. How do you do? Right. Thank you, Johnny Cash. Yeah. District Attorney Tom Stewart, William Jennings Bryan, who had 3 times been presidential candidate for the Democrats, failed every time, but he was famous particularly as representing the rural constituency. That was the core of his support, and that was to play itself out in how the trial unfolded and also the long-term effects of it. And for the defense was Clarence Darrow, who was a member of the ACLU, and he was one of the country's top lawyers. He was already extremely famous for several high-profile cases. And John Neal, who was a law professor from Knoxville in Tennessee, of course.
So all of these people are in on the charade on both sides.
Yeah, that's right.
And what was the specific outcome that they were hoping for from this?
Well, obviously, the prosecution are wanting to prosecute Scopes. Nobody really envisages that he's going to be seriously punished, and the defence are hoping to make the law a laughingstock, in which they succeed. But a lot of people are simply interested, not really one way or the other, like this guy Sue Hicks. They simply want to bring publicity to this little town, which is exactly what happened. Okay, so we've got a picture here of John Scopes on the left and his defense lawyer Clarence Darrow in the middle, and another defense attorney over on the right there, walking through Dayton while the trial's going on. And they're just coming under a poster, "Read your Bible." These kind of posters were all over town, actually. We've got a picture of Scopes at the trial. You can see he's just a very fresh-faced young fellow. For the prosecution, here's William Jennings Bryan. The picture shows him a number of years before, in 1907, during the height of his political career. In fact, he died just a week after the end of the trial, the stress that he was under as a result. I think it caused him to have a heart attack. And we'll see, how he, suffered and performed actually very badly in the trial. It's kind of hard not to feel sorry for him, actually. Here he is as at the height of his oratory as a politician, not in the trial, some years before. Okay, well, let's drill down into the trial itself and how it plays itself out. These are John Butler's reflections during the trial and after it. He says, I never had any idea my bill would make a fuss. I just thought it would become a law and everybody would abide by it and we wouldn't hear any more of evolution in Tennessee. But perhaps a little naive and shows how little he really thought this through. And after the trial was over, no, I didn't know anything about evolution when I introduced it. I'd read in the papers that boys and girls were coming home from school and telling their fathers and mothers that the Bible was all nonsense, which was what motivated him to sponsor this bill.
So having legislators who quite literally didn't know what they were talking about or legislating for is not a new phenomenon.
No, it's not, actually. That's always consoling, given the days that we're living in, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't know that consoling is the right word, but
Yeah, no, it's not really, is it? I'm clutching at straws, I suppose, to try and keep what little remains of my sanity. Okay, now we're going to be looking at the course of the trial quite a bit through the eyes of this man who is A, extremely funny, and B, extremely nasty. H.L. Mencken, a famous journalist and a wit and an atheist and an anti-Semite. Oh my gosh. And so he writes a number of newspaper columns reporting on this. Now, this is not about the trial. This is simply to give you the flavor of what this guy is like. He was a kind of libertarian. He was also anti-democratic. He was an elitist. He was aware of how smart he was, and he thought that people that weren't as clever as him shouldn't have the vote, and he liked belittling them. He would have gone down really well in the Roman Empire, actually. That's sort of a person. The ideal government of all reflective men, from Aristotle onward, is one which lets the individual alone, one which barely escapes being no government at all. This ideal, I believe, will be realized in the world 20 or 30 centuries after I have passed from these scenes and taken up my public duties in hell. So, yeah, we can see that he's A, blasphemous, and B, funny with it. Okay, so here are some of his reports on the monkey trial, which is happening in July and in the South, so it's good and hot. And of course, these are in the days before air conditioning. So 2 months ago, the town, Dayton, Tennessee, was obscure and happy. Today, it is a universal joke. I've been attending the permanent town meeting that goes on in Robinson's drugstore, trying to find out what the town optimists have saved from the wreck. All I can find is a sort of mystical confidence that God will somehow come to the rescue to reward his old and faithful partisans as they deserve. More specifically, it's believed that settlers will be attracted to the town as to some refuge from the atheism of the great urban Sodoms and Gomorrah. But will these refugees bring any money with them? Will they buy lots and build houses? Will they light the fires of the cold and silent blast furnace down the railroad tracks? On these points, I regret to report, optimism has to call in theology to aid it. Well, this picture shows some of Brian's supporters, so for the prosecution in Dayton. So this is the headquarters of the Anti-Evolution League, the conflict, hell, and the high school. This is absolutely classic fundamentalist style rhetoric, right? So they're selling Brian's books on sale and other stuff. So, but back to Mencken. The town, I confess, greatly surprised me. I expected to find a squalid southern village with darkies snoozing on the horse blocks, pigs rooting under the houses, and the inhabitants full of hookworm and malaria. What I found was a country town of charm and even beauty.
So he's scornful of black people, rural people, and religious people. He is rather horrible, isn't he?
Yeah, he's, he really is. Yes, and then he makes you laugh again, and you're tempted to forgive him, though you probably shouldn't.
Definitely not.
No. Okay, continuing with Mencken. The selection of a jury to try Scopes, which went on all yesterday afternoon in the atmosphere of a blast furnace because of the heat of summer, showed to what extreme lengths the salvation of the local primates has been pushed.
So he's insisting that they're basically monkeys or evolutionary throwbacks.
Yeah, that's basically just a northern townie making fun of southern rurals. That's what's going on here. And in a sense, that's not just part of the cause, but even more part of the consequence of this trial. It was obvious after a few rounds that the jury would be unanimously hot for Genesis. The most that Mr. Darrow, the defense lawyer, remember, could hope for was to sneak in a few bold enough to declare publicly that they would have to hear the evidence against Scopes before condemning him. So what he's saying is, all these people are determined to convict Scopes anyway without hearing anything. In brief, this is a strictly Christian community, and such is its notion of fairness, justice, and due process of law. Its people are simply unable to imagine a man who rejects the literal authority of the Bible. The most they can conjure up, straining until they're red in the face, is a man who is in error about the meaning of this or that text. Thus, one accused of heresy among them is like one accused of boiling his grandmother to make soap in Maryland.
Yeah, I'm sure he was very familiar with that.
Yeah, probably. Okay, now interjection here. We'll come back to Mencken in a minute. This is a passage taken from a really, really excellent book that we pointed people to in the previous episode, and that's George Marsden's Fundamentalism in American Culture. And one of the more painful episodes he describes is how William Jennings Bryan made a complete hash of being in the witness stand for the prosecution and how Darrow made mincemeat of him. So Bryan was better at oratory than debate, but he allowed himself to be cross-examined by the greatest trial lawyer of the day. Darrow forced Bryan into admitting that he could not answer the standard village atheist type questions regarding the literal interpretation of Scripture. Brian did not know how Eve could be created from Adam's rib, where Cain got his wife, or where the great fish came from that swallowed Jonah. He said that he had never contemplated what would happen if the earth stopped its rotation so that the sun would stand still, which had been the subject of this famous sermon by a black preacher in the previous century, "De sun do move." Right, that. Right. In a masterpiece of ridicule, Darrow led Brian reluctantly to say that he basically accepted Bishop Ussher's chronology as printed in many Bibles.
Bishop Ussher?
Yeah, more about him at the end, but just for now, he was the one who came up with a date for God creating the world on a literalist reading.
Oh.
Pressing the advantage, Darrow continued, when was the flood? Brian, I would not attempt to fix a date. Darrow, but what do you think the Bible itself says? Don't you know how it was arrived at? Brian, I never made a calculation. Darrow, a calculation from what? Brian, I could not say. Darrow, what do you think? Brian, I do not think about things I don't think about. Darrow, do you think about things you do think about? Brian, well, sometimes. It's getting pretty catastrophic.
This sounds like me when I'm trying to get away with something with my husband.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Right.
Yeah.
So here we have a picture of Brian being basically tortured like this in court.
You do feel a bit bad for him.
Yeah. Well, no, it was obviously very bad for his health. He died shortly after. So, okay, back to Mencken. So, July 13th, the second day of the trial, it'd be hard to imagine a more moral town than Dayton. If it has any bootleggers, remember this is during the Prohibition era, no visitor has heard of them. There is no gambling. There's no place to dance. The relatively wicked, when they would indulge themselves, go to Robinson's drugstore and debate theology. All that remains of the great cause of the state of Tennessee against the infidel Scopes is the formal business of bumping off the defendant. There may be some legal jousting on Monday and some gaudy oratory on Tuesday, but the main battle is over, with Genesis completely triumphant. The Scopes trial from the start has been carried on in a manner exactly fitted to the anti-evolution law and the simian imbecility under it. There hasn't been the slightest pretense to decorum. The rustic judge, a candidate for re-election, has postured the yokels like a clown in a 10-cent sideshow, and almost every word he's uttered has been an undisguised appeal to their prejudices and superstitions. The chief prosecuting attorney, beginning like a competent lawyer and a man of self-respect, ended like a convert at a Billy Sunday revival. What he said, in brief, was that a man accused of infidelity, unbelief, had no rights whatever under Tennessee law. I mean, I'm sure he didn't say anything of the sort. This is clearly Mencken editorializing like crazy. Okay. Darrow has lost this case. Remember, Darrow's maybe the most famous lawyer in America. It was lost long before he came to Dayton. But it seems to me that he has nevertheless performed a great public service by fighting it to a finish and in a perfectly serious way. Let no one mistake it for comedy, farcical though it may be in all its details. It serves notice on the country that Neanderthal man is organizing in these forlorn backwaters of the land, led by a fanatic rid of sense and devoid of conscience.
It's quite the description.
Yeah. Why does he hold back like this? Why doesn't he tell us what he really
Right.
thinks? Marsden says a couple of pages after the bit that we quoted there that Mencken didn't, in respect of Brian, Mencken didn't allow the fact of mere death to stand in his way of kind of castigating and mocking Brian. So he was completely merciless. And what does he say at some point? He had some really funny line, but it's very naughty. He was making the point that fundamentalists were all over the country. A random person would turn out to be a fundamentalist. So he puts it like, heave an egg out of a Pullman window, a railroad car window, and he will splatter a fundamentalist anywhere in America today. Oh dear, dear. Okay, so here we have a cartoon from the Chicago Defender newspaper.
Yeah, so one monkey is saying to the other, "Do you believe fiends like those are descendants of ours?" And the mob is carrying out a lynching.
Right, right. Now, I'm not quite sure whether they're saying that the mob doing the lynching consists of fundamentalists, or whether it's simply saying, because this is the high tide of lynchings in the aftermath of World War One, the 1920s, absolutely appalling and happening, not just in the South, Gary, Indiana, loads of northern towns. Oh my goodness. The Ku Klux Klan running rampant. That was their high tide, like their second coming as well. Maybe the point is simply, given how much wickedness there is in our society, monkeys would be ashamed of us. It may be simply that point
Right.
that's going on there. I don't know. Okay, so the result of the trial then. Scopes was convicted. Our prosecutor Stewart had, apart from the exchanges between Darrow and Bryan, he'd excluded, believe it or not, all discussion of science or religion and insisted upon strict legality. What does the law say? What has Scopes done? And Scopes was fined $100, which was not a complete fortune even then, and that was later quashed on appeal on a technicality.
So all the fuss was basically for nothing. It's entirely symbolic.
Yes, it was really a very public contest between two outlooks, which it seems like both the prosecutors and the defense had wanted it to be. Remember that the defense had invited Scopes to get himself prosecuted, right? So, and it turned into an absolute public circus. But one of the things I'd want to point out is that both sides were modernists, although neither the supporters of fundamentalism nor fundamentalism's enemies could have admitted that about the fundamentalist side. Why are they both modernists? Because both take it for granted that the way to read a text, including an ancient text like this, is a literalist reading. And so the so called modernists and liberals are saying, but this is absurd, therefore the text has no authority. And the fundamentalists are going into bat for the absurd reading of the text and ending up looking foolish, right? Because even someone who'd been presidential candidate 3 times couldn't begin to defend it. Although in later decades, fundamentalists would attempt at least somewhat more sophisticated defenses, but we're not going to dive into that right now. Okay, so the enormous publicity around the trial had reflected very badly on fundamentalists, and the very word now came to be associated primarily with an insistence upon a literalist reading of early Genesis and the historicity of that reading. And just as a postscript here, despite this, the Butler Act was not finally repealed in Tennessee until a legal challenge 42 years later in 1967.
So this whole time, the teachers have to dance around this.
Yes, yes. Okay, so in summary, the trial is a test case by the ACLU. Dayton businessmen went along with it, not because they really sided one way or the other, but to bring publicity to their town, in which they were triumphantly successful. That the Butler Act was in conflict with the state's own required textbook, Hunter's Civic Biology, which taught evolution, so the state of the law was self-contradictory. Hunter's book was racist and taught eugenics, so any claim that enlightenment was all on one side of the case is absurd. The trial became a public circus. It made plain that Butler knew nothing about evolution and that Bryan knew far too little about the Bible. The journalistic coverage makes it clear the case was in some ways a showdown between city and country, and perhaps between North and South. And the outcome would sharply define fundamentalism for the next 50 years.
So define fundamentalism in the sense that literalism about early Genesis was now its key defining feature.
Yes, yes. I mean, there are other things as well, particularly as we mentioned in the previous episode. Please, anybody who missed that, go back and have a look. dispensationalism was not required to be a fundamentalist, but it was more and more dominant within the fundamentalist movement because they take the same kind of, excuse me, but crazy exegesis, say in respect of Revelation. So, they're the best literalists. Okay, well, back with a little commentary here from Marsden. So after the trial, fundamentalism was a focal point for the real hostility of rural America toward much of modern culture and intellect. Some tent-meeting revivalists had long been capitalizing on anti-liberal sentiments, yet those elements had never been central to the movement. Fundamentalism had long been predominantly urban, with its strength in the northern and eastern section of the country. That takes some effort to remember that now, right? In the past, its opponents were inclined to suspect that fundamentalism was controlled by conservative business and political interests. But after 1925, that all changes, right? And it's simply something that is looked down on culturally and intellectually as being something for rural hicks. Another consequence that held sway after 1925 was the obscurantist label that would ever after stick to fundamentalists, anti-intellectual. Right? Nor could they raise the level of discourse to a plane where any of their arguments would be taken seriously. So this was very debilitating. Now, as we did with our series on the Roman Catholic Church, we're going to take this series through to a point where they manage to get out of that dead end that they've got themselves into. But I'm afraid we're going to have to stick with the gloomy stuff for a couple of episodes yet.
Do you think that some of this back and forth rhetoric is like leftover from the Civil War?
Some of it may be, yes. I mean, even after the Civil War, the North and the South remained very different societies to one another. And to an extent, that's still there now, although greatly diminished, particularly after World War II. I'm not going to pursue this very far. I'm just going to throw a remark out there. And if some people want to disagree, well, I'm not going to meet them on it. I'll just throw it out. It's the invention of and the popularization of air conditioning that totally transformed the Southern economy. And I would go so far as to argue that it even made the civil rights movement and its success in the 1960s possible. But we're not going to pursue that one right now. But even after that, there's still a gulf even today. But in the 3/4 of a century after the end of the Civil War, yes, there remained very big differences, and part of that is playing out here.
Well, air conditioning does make me feel like a more civilized person, so.
Well, I think it's only been marginally successful in your case, but okay, if you insist.
Can you imagine?
At least you're not racist, so we'll take it while we're ahead. Okay, well, just to wrap this up, I want to dial the clock back almost 1,000 years, actually, and pick on some document from the 11th century as an example that clarifies how pre-modern documents work and how pre-modern people instinctively understood them, and why both sides here are completely mistaken in insisting upon a literalist reading of early Genesis. So this is an excerpt from something called the Nestorian Chronicle, nothing to do with the Nestorian Church, for anybody who knows about that. It's called Nestorian because it was written by a monk called Nestor. Very mundane explanation. And he was writing about 100 years after the events he describes about the Christianization of Kievan Rus, which is kind of like an ancestor state of both Ukraine and Russia. We're not going to dive into that one. Right. And he gives a whole load of factual account about how Prince Volodymyr tested out the waters about changing from paganism to Christianity. We can't go into all the details of all that. But at the end of the story, he decides he's going to accept Orthodox Christianity from Byzantium. And he travels down to Crimea to meet the Byzantine emperor, marry that emperor's sister, Anna, so he's allied with the emperor, and be baptized as an Orthodox Christian. And then he goes with his new bride back to Kiev and insists that his subjects accept the same new faith. Now, Clearly, this is no way to spread Christianity, but this is what happened.
Yeah,
Right.
this is all factual. This actually happened.
That's the core of the fact. There's a whole load of stuff around it which is possibly or even probably mythological and in the category of the kind of passage that we're going to look at now. Okay. Then Volodymyr sent heralds throughout the whole city, Kiev, to proclaim that if any inhabitant, rich or poor, did not betake himself to the river to be baptized as a Christian, he would become the prince's enemy. But I'm afraid this was about standard for the early Middle Ages. When the people heard these words, they wept with joy, maybe, and exclaimed in their happiness, if this were not good, the prince and his boyars, nobles, would not have accepted it. Now, there's a whole lot we could say about that, and we're not going to. The following day, the prince went forth to the Dnieper River with a countless multitude assembled. They all went into the water. Now, here's the crucial bit. There was joy in heaven and on earth to behold so many souls saved. And the devil spoke quietly. Woe is me, I am driven out from here, but now I am vanquished by the ignorant, not by apostles and martyrs, and my reign in these lands is at an end. Now, when I used to use this document in class, I would always add the sarcastic rider. And of course, we know that evil has been at an end in Ukraine and Russia ever since. And then the students would all laugh. But that's not the point we want to make here. All right, let's ask some questions. And most of these questions, I warn you, are dumb. But let's ask them anyway. Who wrote down the devil's words? And did the devil slow down so the scribe could keep up? Slow down a minute. I'm just writing this down. How do you spell that word? And what do we think of a chronicler who's consorted with Satan?
I mean, the devil speaks in the Bible, so apparently he's talkative.
Right, but who's listening to him and who's writing down his words?
Right.
Right? What I'm really putting my finger on is who believes this as a literal statement of fact? Right? And remember, this is all written 100 years later anyway. But let us suppose that the chronicler is depending on contemporary sources that are not available to us because they've been lost or destroyed or something, corroded, whatever. Right. And if no one recorded the devil, is Nestor making this up? I think most of us will want to answer, well, yes. Okay. Is he trying to deceive his readers?
Ooh, trick question.
What are we? Yeah, well, it's not a trick question. Think about it. Is he?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think he's making a point, right?
Right, he's making a point.
Yeah.
Okay, now I realize that all Westerners have been brought up to think that anybody who has not been born and brought up in the modern or postmodern West is basically stupid. So let's ask this question. Would his readers have understood the account of what the devil said literally?
I seriously doubt it.
Right. They understood what was happening here. Nestor was not attempting to deceive them, neither was he deceiving them. Right. So if they wouldn't have understood it literally, what would they have understood by this account?
It's adding to the quality of the Christianity, I guess.
What's being explained to us is the meaning of what has happened in spiritual terms. Right.
Right.
This is what Nestor believed was the reality, even if the words himself, he's making them up. But for goodness sake, even Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War admits that the speeches he gives his characters, he made them up, but amounted to the purport of what they would truly have said, or what a person would truly have said in that circumstance, right? And he's, by comparison with most pre-modern accounts, a stickler for strict factuality, right?
Right.
And even he admits that. Most pre-modern chroniclers are far more liberal in the way they record things than that. They're telling us the meaning of what happened. Now, what does that tell us about how to read pre-modern texts?
You have to read them in context of what's going on.
Of what's going on and what meaning is being conveyed.
Right.
Okay, now because time is short here, we're going to take it for granted, and if we're wrong about this in respect of a particular viewer, that people generally know what's in the early chapters of Genesis. And if you're not familiar with that, then please go really slow as you're watching this. Stop, keep hitting pause, have Genesis open in front of you. So, leaving aside historical literalism, what is early Genesis telling us? What do these stories mean? They're explaining to us who God is and the nature of divine creation, that he speaks the universe into existence. That's how he makes something that's distinct from his own essence, right? If he had created simply out of his own substance, then that would be basically pantheism, and we'd probably all have to become some kind of pantheists or maybe Hindus or something like that. So it's telling us, no, we're distinct from God, but he's created us, but we're not part of his essence. It's telling us what human beings are, created in the image of God, which is a huge subject in itself. We can't go there now, but maybe hunt through my Substack blog, and there's an excellent article that goes into the ins and outs of that.
Doubtless.
Piercing the Gloom, it's called, on Substack. Right. The relations between the sexes, the relation between humanity and the natural environment, the primordial nature of human sin in Genesis chapter 3, and its consequences for our estrangement from God and from one another, and our primeval instinct to blame God and one another for our sins. And that's played out as well in Genesis chapter 3. And human society originating from fratricide, brother murdering brother, and injustice. All of that is there. And if we've got a hold of that, then we've got a hold of some of the most important things we can know about God, about ourselves, about human society, and the nature of the world that we're living in. Right? And that is what is being conveyed there.
Right, which is similarly really what the rest of the Bible is conveying to us. And I think the issue that a lot of, especially fundamentalists, would want to take with the idea of Genesis being symbolic rather than, cold hard facts, is that if you say that Genesis is, a fairy tale, essentially, then do you throw out the whole Bible along with it? Is it all just right? Is it all just made up?
And of course, lots of the Bible isn't like that. It is telling us historical accounts. Particularly is this true when we come to, say, the New Testament, the life of Jesus, and so on.
Right.
Pre-modern people knew how to read pre-modern texts, and modern people who pride themselves on their cleverness and sophistication don't. Whether it's the sophisticates side in the Dayton, the Scopes monkey trial, or the fundamentalists, right? Neither of them understand this. Well, let's just finish off here by coming back to that bishop, well, actually, he was an archbishop, James Ussher. Where does the 4004 BC date come from that fundamentalists want to insist on? Actually, I think it's October the 23rd or something incredibly precise, right? Yeah, we got it here, October 23rd. Okay, Archbishop James Ussher was born in 1581. He was Archbishop of Armagh in Ireland, right? And his most famous book, written in 1650, Annales Veteris Testamenti a Prima Mundi Origine Deducti, the annals of the Old Testament and the first origins of the world deduced, in which he calculates this date for creation. Now, we call the 16th, 17th, and probably the first half of the 18th century the early modern period for a darn good reason, right? That this is the point at which Western minds are becoming modern and are taking it for granted that a text needs to be understood literally in literalist terms and evaluated on those terms. And that being so, he wants to make that kind of calculation. Whereas before this, mostly Christians had lived perfectly comfortably without doing this to the Bible, right? So you've got to be a certain kind of modern, in this case early modern, even to ask that kind of question, really. I mean, I don't want to push that too far because some Byzantines had made a similar kind of calculation. They come up with a rather different date. But nevertheless, that had not been any major part of biblical hermeneutics or exegesis before this point. You need to be a modernist to think like this. And then once Ussher's done this or something very similar to it, maybe Ussher's wrong, but he might be wrong by a couple of years or something like that. Whereas, of course, what modern science was demonstrating was that is orders of magnitude wrong, but it doesn't matter because that's not the way you're supposed to read this kind of text. But then when people want to go into bat for that because they sense correctly, actually, that the Bible as a whole is under assault, along with a whole load of other Christian values in their time, and then they very, very unwisely go and fight this battle, and they end up looking very foolish needlessly.
Right. Right. And this is funny to me because modern science is able to give us this date, October 23rd, 4004 BC. But modern science also gives us evolution. And so modern science is all fine and good when it gives us the beginning date of the world, but not when it brings us something that we don't like evolution.
Well, right. And the point that I want to make is that you can't use these kind of modernist thought forms in approaching pre-modern texts that were never understood in this kind of way. Right? It's one more aspect of the foolish idea that modern Westerners have been telling themselves for hundreds of years, which is basically that all of their ancestors were stupid, and nothing could be further from the truth. In so many respects, it's we who are stupid because we don't understand. But certainly when I was teaching class, another way that I used to make this point was when touched on Acts chapter 2, which is the day of Pentecost. And there were Jews there from every nation under heaven, it says. So we just mentioned that. And then I would give dramatic pause and say, yeah, every nation under heaven. They were from New Zealand and Chile and Japan and Botswana. And of course, the students who would look at me like, what? That's what it says. But of course, it doesn't mean that, does it? So why are we foisting dumb literalist meanings on the text, right? When in any case, you and I speak metaphorically, not in non-literalist senses all the time.
Right.
And then they would nod and say, right, as you just did. And then I'd got them again and I'd say, but of course, I just did it there. We don't speak literally all the time in metaphors. Sometimes we literally mean what we say, but you understood what I said,
Right.
didn't you?
Right.
Right? So why do we insist that the Bible has to talk in a completely different way when we don't even do that with one another in everyday conversations? We're ending up pushing ourselves into stupid types of hermeneutic. Right? And this is what's going on the grand scale here. Anyway, I think we've made our point and we've probably made enough people angry.
I would just, for anybody, any maybe young Christians shaking in their boots right now, wondering how they're ever going to read the Bible again, do you have any advice for the enlightened modern day reader on how to discern which is which?
Well, avoid both kinds of thoughtless modernist, whether it is liberal Bible debunkers who are not much help, or fundamentalist exegeses who will end up pushing you to defend the indefensible.
Right.
So I would say go for basically conservative, either evangelical or maybe Catholic, biblical commentaries and stuff like that, that will do justice to the fuller picture and have you standing on solid ground and understanding what the text actually meant from its original authors.
Right.
So, yeah. Well, next week, I'm afraid, having set up a pretty dismal picture here, we're going to look at one of the darker episodes, which is basically from 1925, after the monkey, through the late 20s, 30s, 40s, The week after that, we'll dive out into looking at Pentecostalism, which has a related but slightly different and in some ways slightly brighter story. And then, as we did with the Roman Catholic Church, we'll get to a period of emerging into the light, in this case from probably the late 1940s onwards. But that's a few episodes up the road. So thank you for staying with us, everybody, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next week.
Yes, I think this has been one of my favorite episodes so far. So hopefully you enjoyed it, and we'll see you again.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye now.
Bye, everyone.